Hi, welcome back to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graban. Our guest today is Amy C. Edmondson, the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School. She's renowned for her research on psychological safety for more than 20 years now. She was named in 2021 and again just very recently by Thinkers 50 as the #1 management thinker in the world. Her TED Talk, How to Turn a Group of Strangers into a Team, has been viewed over 3 million times. She received her degrees, her PhD, AM and AB from Harvard University, and she's the author of books including The Fearless Organization, a great book on psychological safety, the book Teaming, and some related books there. And her latest, Right Kind of Wrong, was released, I believe, in September. It's certainly available now. So, Amy, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm excited to talk about the book and to talk about psychological safety. That's a topic that has been brought up by many guests on the show here. But we do always kind of start with a standard question here. So what would you say is your favorite mistake, or at least a favorite mistake?
Well, I have two categories of favorite mistakes, and because I've been studying mistakes and failures for 30 years, most of my stories are from my research, even though I have many mistakes in my own life. So let me give you two. One is one that I write about in Right Kind of Wrong, which was it's an old mistake, but it's such a good one. It occurs back in 1888 when a young man named Lee Kum-shung, who was a 26-year-old chef at a restaurant in Guangdong in China, left his oysters cooking too long. He basically burnt the oysters. Which is a mistake, not a desirable one. And, ingredients are costly and margins are tight. So this matters. Because he left it too long and burnt it up, he came back to this sticky brown mess. He decided smartly to taste it, and it was delicious. And that is how oyster sauce was born. And when his grandson died in 2021, the family was worth more than 17 billion as a result of that mistake. So that to me is, that's why it's a favorite, right? Because it's just quintessential, something you didn't mean to do and probably in the moment felt very bad about doing, that gave birth to, a powerhouse company.
Yeah.
Now,
can we talk about that one a little bit more before the second story? So, within the framework of your book and what you've written about before, burning the oysters is what you would call a basic failure, correct?
Yes.
Just not doing what you
a single human error in known territory.
But basically, now tasting that sauce, that could have been a mistake. That was more on the innovation front, to take a risk. Well, tasting something.
It's a pretty small risk if you think about it, right? What's the worst that can happen? You spit it out; it tastes terrible. But why not, right? So I would say that the act of tasting it was maybe an act of curiosity, but certainly a kind of why not, right? This sort of undesired thing has happened. Why not? And then recognize its deliciousness. Probably wasn't too hard to recognize, but to decide, wait a minute, I may be onto something. That could easily have not happened, right? You could have just gone home and told your wife, I burnt the oysters, but it's okay, it tasted pretty good. But to kind of think, wait a minute, maybe there's a product that I could make and bottle here. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Overcooked doesn't bring the same danger as undercooked would in the world of food, and I'm guessing the chef
great point
knew that. But it's good that the chef there didn't, like in a fit of anger, throw the pan or do something.
Right. I love that. Throw the pan at the wall or whatever.
So a couple different types of failures, or it starts to see with the categorization, and is helpful. And I think we'll come back and dig more into that. But I cut you off. There was a second example.
No, well, I was going to say I might as well give it. I mean, this is a very small one, but it was a failure on my part. I mean, a mistake on my part. I was a huge fan of Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset. I read the book Mindset. I did my best as a parent to respond to my sons in a way that encouraged a growth mindset. But in one moment on a ski slope, when my younger son, who was maybe 7 or 8 years old, asked me to watch him come down the slope, stand at the bottom and watch, and I did. And he came down and he said, how'd I do? And I said, you did great. Now, in growth mindset terms, that is a mistake, right? You don't praise the outcome.
Right.
You comment on the process. You're
the
sort
effort.
And of course he wasn't exactly an Olympic level skier. He was just a little kid learning and snow plowing and and trying to make his turns carefully. So it's it's a mistake. It's not really the way you want to interact. It's just like praise for everything uniformly and nothing useful in that content. But to his credit, Nick looked up at me and said, can't you tell me anything I didn't do well so that I can get better?
Oh, wow.
Wow. Right. Wow. I said, I've got one. Like, I've got a kid who's got a growth mindset, even if I'm making mistakes all the time.
Yeah.
It was pretty cool.
Now, like from that moment, did that help you? I mean, we all slip up, right? We can learn something and we can know something is a mistake and we might still repeat it. But did that moment help you be more mindful about not repeating that small parenting mistake?
Yes, it did. I mean, I was so flabbergasted by his insight to understand that wasn't helpful to him, that it absolutely led me to be more thoughtful and more conscious about, so I really would discipline myself to comment on process. And I, really like how you're approaching this problem set, not, oh, aren't you smart? That you're solving that difficult problem so darn quickly, but to comment on process. So I think that reflection, that moment, it was so stunning for me that I did become more mindful going forward.
Yeah, that's great. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, Amy. We've already touched on, we've got these two words, mistake and failure. How do you see the connections between those words?
So many failures in our lives, in our jobs, in our companies are caused by mistakes, but not all failures are caused by mistakes. Some failures are the undesired results of thoughtful hypotheses, right? Of trying something out on purpose in new territory and hoping you're right, but in fact, alas, you're wrong. So that's a failure, but it's not a mistake. There's no mistake in sight, especially if you define a mistake as a deviation from a known practice or protocol. Yeah,
and there's different dictionary definitions of the word mistake being more of an action that leads to, some sort of bad or unexpected outcome. And that's where, like, to me anyway, I think of the mistake as it could be an action or an inaction, possibly leading to a failure, right?
Yes. Right. In fact, many mistakes, fortunately, don't lead to failures, right? We can make a dozen mistakes a day and get away with most of them. I mean, you notice that you've done it, but thankfully, thankfully nothing really bad happened.
But then in business, I mean, I totally agree with you that not all failures are caused by mistakes. Some business failures could be caused by outside factors. Maybe the mistake is not recognizing a shift with new competition, but not, I mean, it's not a simple mistake.
It's not a simple mistake. It's not a failure to observe and use existing knowledge, right? You could call those judgment errors, but it's often a judgment whether or not it's an error, right? Sometimes it really is, if you'd been a little more thoughtful, that would have been clear, but quite often, no, it's in hindsight, it's clear, but at the outset, it might not have been clear.
Well, and then there's that question of, like, in the moment, we see this happen a lot. It's in the news. You might hear it at work where somebody makes a decision and someone else says, that's a mistake. I'm like, well, that other person maybe has a different hypothesis about what's about to take place. We don't know.
Right. it's a different prediction, right? They have a different prediction than you. Now, I do think you have you should be motivated to listen to why they see it differently, because that may, in fact, change your mind. But it may be that that you both there's uncertainty and you have a different view, and it's really not knowable unless you go try it.
Yeah. So one thing you wrote about that really resonated with me is there's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, variations of fail early, fail often. And like, I don't think failing is the end goal, like failing often. Like where do you think that phrase somehow kind of misses the mark?
Well, I think it misses the mark by inadvertently implying, maybe not on purpose, but inadvertently implying a kind of one-size-fits-all prescription, right? That all of us should be more willing to fail early and fail often. Well, yes, and only in certain conditions is that helpful advice, right? And for me, those conditions are absolutely limited to when we are knowingly in new territory and when the stakes are manageable, the risks are manageable. Then, because there's no other way to get the knowledge you truly want and need, you've got to try things, because you're not trying them hoping they fail. You're trying hoping they succeed. You really hope you're right with your hypothesis or with your test, and you just are willing and emotionally ready to accept the possibility you might not be right. I mean, I think that's what that phrase is all about. And in that sense, it's powerful and useful, but let's limit it to the contexts where it makes sense. And let's also be clear that we're not setting out to fail. We're setting out to experiment.
Yeah.
And it becomes quite obvious how nonsensical it would be to tell people in a cardiac surgery operating room, fail early, fail often. It's like, what are you talking about? No, thank you. Or
right.
Passenger air travel. No, that's dumb.
Yeah. And being open to the idea that we could be wrong, that we could fail. Then I think if we are able to detect that, willing to admit that, adjust and learn. I mean, the phrase might be fail early, learn from it, succeed later. That's not as pithy.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to have failures, it's better to have them early, and it's better to have them small.
Yeah. Right.
And then steel yourself to, because even though they're early and they're small, you still won't like them in the moment, right? You'll still be disappointed. And yet, probably the thing I've spent the most time exploring from a research point of view is, can you talk about them? Are you willing to talk about them? Is your team a kind of place where people talk about them?
Yeah.
Because that's just so crucial, because you'll learn. I hope you'll learn. I mean, you won't learn if you don't reflect, but it's even better if all your colleagues can learn too, and thereby prevent the preventable failure of repeating that same failure.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different directions this conversation can go from here, but maybe let's touch on psychological safety. Like there's people's, if you will, I don't know, willingness to admit an error, but given a certain situation, it might not feel safe. Can you give us your definition of psychological safety and why that's necessary to have a culture of learning from mistakes?
I define psychological safety as a belief that your context is safe for interpersonal risks, like speaking up to ask for help when you're in over your head, like speaking up to admit a mistake or acknowledge a failure or point to someone else's mistake that you see them happening. And I think it's important to clarify, I'm not aware of any place on earth where that's easy. But I am aware of places where people believe it's expected, it's acceptable. You won't be, rejected by your colleagues. It's just, we understand we have to do that, right? Whether it's to provide safe patient care or to, develop really innovative products and services. Like, people just say, that's what we got to do around here, even though it isn't fun.
Yeah. And I've been in some workplaces that are very, very low in that spectrum, or at least I felt it. And I've thankfully been part of some teams where I felt like it was very high, and I saw it demonstrated where it was a norm of somebody sharing, hey, here's a mistake I made this week, even if it was in that basic failure kind of realm, just to say, hey, just so you know, because the same thing might happen to you in the way we use Gmail or something mundane like that.
Right.
And then when the CEO speaks up and says, oh, well, oh gosh, that's happened to me.
Yes.
And here's something I did that I think helps. I think that is, I think represents high psychological safety.
It represents it, and it reinforces it, which is so great, right? Because it can be a kind of positive feedback loop in the same way that it can be a negative feedback loop if someone speaks up earnestly and honestly about something they did wrong, and then they get pounced on, they're never going to do it again.
Right. We learn quickly.
What's one trial learning.
Yeah. So back to the kind of the breakdown of different types of failures that I think you spell out really clearly in the book. There's some stories in there about developing a brand new surgical procedure on the leading edge of innovation versus, I had a guest on this podcast a long time ago who was an anesthesiologist who admitted, I think, what we would call a basic failure of an attending surgeon, or no, the resident surgeon, my mistake, cutting into the wrong side of the patient on a very routine procedure. Yes. You think of situations like that, and you use these two different words in the book: praiseworthy, and I'll say this carefully because I know there's a lot of nuance you get into, blameworthy.
Right.
Thinking of two different situations like that, what are your thoughts?
Well, we need to know more about them. So let me first describe what I call the three types or three archetypes of failure. And you're absolutely right that the sort of wrong side surgery is almost always be categorized as a basic failure, because it's like a single cause. Basic failure has a single cause, usually human error. I mean, I suppose occasionally some unexpected event from the outside might just come in and turn off the power or something, and could still be a basic failure. One cause, right? Mm-hmm. One cause, bad outcome. And it's very hard for me to imagine a wrong side surgery that isn't a basic failure, right? Because you knew in advance which was the diseased side, and maybe the X-ray was put up backwards or something, but it's an error, right? It's an error. Let's not have those. In fact, I think we should all be dedicating ourselves to making basic failures few and far between. Mm-hmm. Complex failures are multi-causal, right? And generally, the quintessential complex failure has many causes that many factors that happen to line up in just the wrong way and create a failure, where none of them on their own would have led to a bad outcome. But it was the combination of them. And I've studied many of them, but maybe one of the best known ones in the world today is the Boeing 737 MAX airline crashes. Those were quintessential complex failures, and I won't go into the 20 or 30 factors that come together. But those two, when we're at our best, are preventable. Right? When we speak up quickly and early about a concern, about the way something's unfolding, or some small deviation that we see that on its own might not seem like much, but could create a vulnerability. So, at our best, we've got high reliability organizations. We're not mistake free, because we fallible human beings will always make mistakes, but we can be reasonably failure free, because we can get very, very good at catching and correcting before bad things happen. And then the third kind of failure I call them intelligent failures, and they are the undesired but thoughtful foray into new territory, where literally there was no other way to know what would happen without trying it, without that experiment. So that's the three types of failure. Now, what I say, just to kind of illustrate the idea that in most organizations, we don't have what we might call a healthy failure culture or a healthy mistake culture, is that if you think about any failure in an organization, that's big enough to care about, it's not just, a paper cut. Right? And then you have to ask the question, as one always does, like, what caused it? And then let's say we step back and we figure out what caused it. And then I say, well, there's a spectrum of possibilities of causes. So this is different than the type of failure, but it's the types of causes. And I can array those types of causes on a spectrum from totally blameworthy to totally praiseworthy, right? Whereas blameworthy is, sabotage, deliberately doing the wrong thing, maybe deliberately turning that X-ray around the wrong way so that the surgeon would harm the patient. I mean, unthinkable. I cannot think of anything like that ever happening. But if that were to happen, we would all of us, I think, would recommend, you're out. That's it. It's a totally blameworthy act, and it's not acceptable under any conditions. So now let's go all the way to the other side of the spectrum, where I have, a thoughtful experiment that ends in failure. That's a praiseworthy action, right? As long as it was thoughtful and not foolhardy, right? So you did your homework, you thought it through, you thought this might help our customers, and and you were wrong. Okay, so we should be giving you a nice round of applause. Now, and so here's the kind of litmus test that I like to play with for organizations or teams, which is, I just say, sort of hypothetically, what percent of failures are caused by blameworthy acts? And people usually say, oh, very few. They're even reluctant to give a number, but it's just not how we roll. And then I say, okay, I buy it. And then I say, well, excuse me, what percent of failures in your organization get treated as if they were caused by blameworthy acts? And then there's usually laughter or a gasp, where it's like, oh, all of them or most of them.
Yeah.
And so they're illustrating to themselves that we still don't have the right mindset around failures, right? When we realize that we're fallible human beings, we will make mistakes. There will be accidents. There will be experiments that don't pan out. How do we react to them in such a way that truly keep encouraging people to try their hardest in our naturally volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world?
Yeah. And what you point out through, surveying people that way lines up to something I've observed, that there's this interesting gap where on an individual level, people say things like, oh, failure, mistakes can be your best teacher, some variation of that phrase. Like, that seems not controversial. And then how does that then not translate when an organization is a collection of people? The organization seems to lose sight of
It's true.
idea.
I think it's old habits, like old incentive structures, mindsets that are a vestige from the industrial era, where you really could put in place plans or processes to be followed, and expect with a high degree of certainty that if that plan or process is followed, the result would be exactly what was desired, what was needed, or Model T Ford. There it is at the very end of the line, just as you expect. And if you don't get that Model T at the end of the line, then that means somebody somewhere didn't do what they were told. And it's just laughable, to think about how few of our work environments in the 21st century fit into that kind of, sort of predictable space.
Right.
And yet our habits are holding on tight, our habits and our mindsets.
Yeah. And then, one of those old habits or mindsets that I still run across. I mean, so, earlier we talked about people who might be, almost flippant about failure. Like, oh, fail early, fail often.
Yeah.
But they're being reckless. They're not doing thoughtful experiments, as you're pointing out. Like that, and it's not guaranteed that failure leads to learning either, right? So people just say, hey, who cares? We're going to go try because we'll fail early, fail often. They might go out of business.
Sloppy and wasteful, right? So if you have, a failure and you don't learn from it, I think that's just waste. Because you've made this investment, you've bought this thing, but now use it, right? Use your investment to inform your future.
Yeah.
And help.
Yeah. And then there's that second cause of waste, I guess, when leaders are super negative about mistakes. They'll say things like failure is not an option. They'll demand perfection. I've heard leaders say things like, well, when people make mistakes, I mean, we have to punish them. Otherwise we're giving permission for more. And that's always like, my head is not literally exploded from that, but
but it's quite illogical, because in fact, it's not only illogical, it's counterproductive. It's illogical because you're assuming that people make mistakes, because they're not trying hard enough. They're not motivated to avoid them, and it's counterproductive because when you take that stance, you don't make humans suddenly perfect. What happens is you just increase dramatically the chances that you won't hear the truth anymore, right? And that isn't a good outcome.
And we see, and you quoted the late great W. Edwards Deming in the book, and there's famous stories going back to Deming's days of plant managers demanding 0 injuries, and we were going to give a prize if we have 0 injuries, and people just stopped reporting the obvious visible injuries that had occurred. But then in your work around psychological safety, there are things that we can do, even in a healthcare setting, to help people feel safe. Not just that they're speaking up, but they're actually being heard, and that it's leading to improvement. Can you share some thoughts on like trying to shift that culture to one where there are more reports?
Right. In fact, my initial interest in and sort of discovery of differences in psychological safety came from a study of medication errors. And what I stumbled into by accident, without looking for this, was phenomenal differences, substantial differences in reporting behavior, sort of the willingness to report the things that went wrong. And that sort of struck me as quite interesting, right? Because if people can't report, then we, collectively, their teams, their organizations can't learn. And that's risky, it seemed to me. So then I wanted to understand, well, what would make it possible for people over here, one part of an organization, to willingly speak up with these interpersonally threatening messages, whereas another part of the organization, like, no way, no how. It's easy to understand the implications, but what were the factors that explained that? Because they have the same senior leadership, they have the same kind of culture and education and so on, but there's this difference. And ultimately, it became clear to me that it's the sort of local leadership, right? It's the leaders in the middle. It's the middle managers, the branch managers, the unit managers, right? The people in the middle who are kind of the operational leaders for where the work is happening, whether that work is R&D or care delivery or other forms of execution, and how they show up and how they respond to honesty it makes all the difference. And it creates, the possibility of teams that can learn from their own experiences versus ones that really, maybe individuals might be learning, but the teams are not learning. And to me, that's a risk factor.
And I see, I don't know, somewhere I either shake my head or roll my eyes sometimes. I hear a lot of admonitions for, we need a speak up culture. And it's blaming the employee. Whoops, no, I caught you during a sip. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
But I'm like, maybe we should frame it as a listen up culture. Like, we need more listening.
Absolutely. I mean, I obviously both matter, but a speak up culture, you're right. It puts the onus. It sounds like it puts the onus on the employee. And really what we need is a learning culture, right? A culture that realizes that each and every day we have a lot we can learn from each other, from our clients, from the world. Like, we're just approaching it like sponges. Like, what am I, almost selfishly, what am I missing? I got to ask Mark what he sees, because I'm sure I'm missing something that he sees. And then that is both, like, I'm now motivated to listen to you when you speak up, and then you will find it as a positive experience, and vice versa.
So I also wanted to ask you, Amy, because you write quite a bit, getting beyond talking about types of failures and causes of failures, but how to learn, because I mean, it seems not automatic, not as easy as it sounds. Like, what are some of your thoughts, for example, like striking the balance between reflecting and ruminating. Well, I've had some guests who've come on and shared part of their mistake story was that they dwelled on it too long, instead of being able to reflect in a way that was more focused on learning. What are some tips that you have about that?
Yes. And ruminating is such an important and powerful negative force. When you find yourself just going around in circles, and the shame deepens, and and then the loneliness deepens too. So that's clearly not good. And yet we do want to reflect. We don't want to just blithely move on. Oh, that's okay. Mistakes happen. I'm just not going to give it any thought. So I think of reflecting as a profoundly cognitive process that we can train ourselves to engage in it. And it starts with the simple question, what happened? Right? Our brains are leaping to who did it, and am I at fault, and am I bad? Clear that deck, right? Just pause, throw those thoughts out the window, and start with the question, what happened? As if you were a filmmaker just watching the scene unfold. And part of what happened will include things you did that contributed to the outcome, the failure, and maybe some things you didn't do that you could have done, whatever. But you'll just, in a clean, clear, rational way, take a look. What happened? And then what's in it for me? Like, what are the things I can take away from that maybe are a watch out for me going forward? Maybe it's just idiosyncratic. That kind of thing isn't likely to recur. But more often than not, there's at least something that with that simple question, what happened, you can take away. I like the self-discipline that I learned from a mentor of mine, Larry Wilson, of stop, challenge, choose. And stop is just pause, breathe, and then challenge your automatic spontaneous thinking, which is usually overly emotional, maybe, blaming yourself or others. Just challenge it and say, is that the only way to think about this situation? And then choose the healthy response, right? The healthy response is a forward looking, what can I do better? How can I make it up to someone? All of the things, like, think about the future in as productive a way as you can versus getting caught and stuck in the past that you can't change.
Yeah. And I think the oyster sauce story that you started with illustrates those points.
True, isn't it?
Of stop, don't get upset, challenge the idea, well, this is ruined, this is garbage. Right. And they found
it's not garbage, it turns out. It's delicious.
A delicious, positive path forward. Well, Amy, I also want to ask, I like asking authors this question. I think you especially, when you think about inevitable mistakes in the book writing or editing or proofreading or publishing process, what are your thoughts or experiences as an author?
Well, first of all, there will be mistakes, even after all that reading, copy editing, checking it. It turns out, a couple will slip through. I found one. There's probably more, but I found one the other day in chapter 2. There's a place, and I can't believe I missed this. I must have read this chapter 100 times. There is one place where I say I use DNA instead of RNA, and it's an error. Right? It's like, married to a scientist, I should know better, but I made that mistake. But there's another kind. So there's those little mistakes that sneak through and end up in the bound copy, which is a shame. Right. But then there's the mistakes that are in the draft every single day, right? Every single day that I open up the manuscript again to get to work, I see not mistakes that are just like errors, but just like bad writing, or not clear or not simple, or and so the beauty of writing, the pain of writing, but also the beauty of writing is you can keep at it, and just, it doesn't cost anything to throw it out, throw out the bad sentence, or spend the time to clean up the bad sentence and make it better.
Yeah, I think it seems true. Every book published has mistakes slip through. It's human error, even with trained, skilled.
And other people reading it too.
Fatigue and other factors, or our brain thinks it saw something that
confirmation bias, right? it's especially hard to fix to see your own errors in your writing because you know what it's supposed to say.
Yeah, but I know you might get a kick out of this because I know you've studied Toyota and you've written about them in the book. Jeff Liker's book, The Toyota Way, had a typo on page 1 of that book, which I'm not blaming him for. I don't know how.
No, I have that book somewhere around here, but that's so great.
And the same has happened with me when I sat and did the audiobook reading. I think I found as we were going through, either I saw or the audio engineer, I think there was about on average 1 per chapter, and it was little things like just using the number 3 to refer to a chapter instead of spelling out the word. Like there was one place that stylistic change slipped through. Those are things that I would sort of call typos. Now, I will admit, and I believe you when you say others like us more when we admit failures. So actually, as it turns out, related to you, Amy, I think the only factual error that I made in the book was attributing the Google research on psychological safety to you when it was more based upon your work, correct?
Correct. I woke up like other people and read about the Project Aristotle in the New York Times Magazine, and I was astonished and, of course, happy.
Right. Now, I was happy that a sharp-eyed reader pointed it out, and I'm working in more of a print-on-demand world. So,
yes,
I don't know. There's these early copies. There's only a handful of. The risk of that mistake isn't as big. I'm still a little embarrassed by it.
No, but you're just giving me credit I don't deserve. There's no problem with that. No, actually, but I don't know why, that's the sort of the just in time and the iterative. In Right Kind of Wrong, I describe instead of a bias for action, it's a bias for iteration, right? And it's I don't know why publishing isn't more that way, right? Because readers, again, they're very willing to tell you when they find a mistake, and then you can just fix it. But instead, that RNA DNA mistake I just told you about, they're already doing a 4th printing, and it's still there.
Yeah. Well, I hope you won't ruminate about that one too. Sorry to bring that up. Not a favorite mistake, but it's okay. We don't like you less because you admitted you make mistakes, Amy. That's thankful that society operates that way. So again, our guest today has been Amy Edmondson. Her new book is Right Kind of Wrong. I'm sure others have made the mistake of wanting to put in the into the title. It's just Right Kind of Wrong. Was there? So last question. Thinking about titles, like
yes,
discussion of like should the word "the" be in there?
Yeah. Well, and here it is. But I thought about it. When I first came up with it, it was The Right Kind of Wrong.
Yeah.
But it's because of the subtitle, which is The Science of Failing Well. And I couldn't bear to have double the. I don't know if that's just, I think that's just aesthetic. But I thought the was necessary in the subtitle and not necessary in the title.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think it's a terrible error when people stick it in. Okay.
It's better than not referring to the book at all. And a lot of people are talking about it and posting about it. So again, congratulations on the release, Amy. And I'll put links in the show notes, of course, to the website. And I love the cover.
Thank you.
So thank you. I'm really thankful that you could take the time and be a guest here on the podcast today. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.